Hello everybody, and how are you? Hey? I am just inputting my passcode into my MacBook. No, I don't have a MacBook. My iPad mini, first generation. And we shall start reading the second chapter of A Little Princess, but I'm going to just turn another light on. Excuse me a moment. It's not a huge difference, but it does actually help. So here we go. Hopefully my chair won't squeak too much. Chapter 2 of A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And it's called A French Lesson. When Sara entered the schoolroom the next morning, everybody looked at her with wide, interested eyes. Just get rid of that cover. By that time, every pupil, from Lavinia Herbert, who was nearly 13 and felt quite grown up, to Lottie, who was only just 4 and the baby of the school, had heard a great deal about her. They knew very certainly that she was Miss Minchin's show pupil and was considered a credit to the establishment. One or two of them had even caught a glimpse of her French maid, Mariette, who had arrived the evening before. Lavinia had managed to pass Sara's room when the door was open and had seen Mariette opening a box which had arrived late from some shop. Remember, she and her father had gone shopping. It was full of petticoats with lace frills on them. Frills and frills, she whispered to her friend Jessie as she bent over her geography. I saw her shaking them out. I heard Miss Minchin say to Miss Amelia that her clothes were so grand that they were ridiculous for a child. My mamma says that children should be dressed simply. She has got one of those petticoats on now. I saw it when she sat down. She has silk stockings on, whispered Jessie, bending over her geography also. And what little feet! I never saw such little feet. Oh, sniffed Lavinia spitefully, that is the way her slippers are made. My mamma says that even big feet can be made to look small if you have a clever shoemaker. I don't think she is pretty at all. Her eyes are such a queer colour. She isn't pretty as other people are, said Jessie, stealing a glance across the room, but she makes you want to look at her again. She has tremendously long eyelashes, but her eyes are almost green. Sara was sitting quietly in her seat, waiting to be told what to do. She had been placed near Miss Minchin's desk. She was not abashed at all by the many pairs of eyes watching her. I'm just going to open up my thing. Here it is. Yeah, I think that's correct. Right, sorry, I'm just trying to keep an eye on the other technical things that are happening on the other screen on my computer because I forgot to actually have them open because I'm meant to be able to see them. Anyway, yeah, here we go. Carrying on. Sara was sitting quietly in her seat waiting to be told what to do. She had been placed near Miss Minchin's desk. She was not abashed at all by the many pairs of eyes watching her. That means she wasn't embarrassed or feeling awkward about it. She wondered what they were thinking of, and if they liked Miss Minchin, and if they cared for their lessons, and if any of them had a papa at all like her own. She had had a long talk with Emily, that's her doll, about her papa that morning. Excuse me. He is on the sea now, Emily, she had said. We must be very great friends to each other and tell each other things. Emily, look at me. You have the nicest eyes I ever saw, but I wish you could speak. She was a child full of imaginings and whimsical thoughts, and one of her fancies was that there would be a great deal of comfort in even pretending that Emily was alive and really heard and understood. After Mariette had dressed her in her dark blue schoolroom frock and tied her hair with a dark blue ribbon, she went to Emily, who sat in a chair of her own, and gave her a book. You can read that while I am downstairs, she said, and seeing Mariette looking at her curiously, she spoke to her with a serious little face. What I believe about dolls, she said, is that they can do things they will not let us know about. Perhaps, really, Emily can read and talk and walk, but she will only do it when people are out of the room. That is her secret. You see, if people knew that dolls could do things, they would make them work, so perhaps they have promised each other to keep it a secret. If you stay in the room, Emily will just sit there and stare. But if you go out, she will begin to read perhaps, or go and look out of the window. Then if she heard either of us coming, she would just run back and jump into her chair and pretend she had been there all the time. Comme elle est drôle, Mariette said to herself. I can't speak French, obviously. And when she went downstairs, she told the head housemaid all about it. But she had already begun to like this odd little girl who had such an intelligent small face and such perfect manners. She had taken care of children before who were not so polite. Sara was a very fine little person and had a gentle, appreciative way of saying, "If you please, Mariette," "Thank you, Mariette," which was very charming. Mariette told the head housemaid that she thanked her as if she was thanking a lady. "Elle a l'air d'une princesse, cette petite," she said. Indeed, she was very much pleased with her new little princess and liked her place greatly. Her place being the position she had, the job that she had. Just going to make a couple more minor adjustments here. That one I'm going to shut, and so it should make it so it works a bit better for my end of it. Come on, do your thing, because I don't want this one that you're watching stalling and cutting out. So we'll see how we go. And that should have been shut already, so it is now. Excuse me. Itchy, itchy, itchy. That's just the way it is. So, yeah, I am still here. I'm just waiting for this to do its thing. It's a little bit behind. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. Anyway, so indeed she was very much pleased with her new little mistress and liked her place greatly. After Sara had sat in her seat in the schoolroom for a few minutes, being looked at by the pupils, Miss Minchin rapped in a dignified manner upon her desk. "Young ladies," she said, "I wish to introduce you to your new companion." All the little girls rose in their places, and Sara rose also. "I shall expect you all to be very agreeable to Miss Crewe. She has just come to us from a great distance, in fact, from India. As soon as lessons are over, you must make each other's acquaintance." The pupils bowed ceremoniously, and Sara made a little courtesy, and then they sat down and looked at each other again. "Sara," said Miss Minchin in her schoolroom manner, "come here to me." She had taken a book from the desk and was turning over its leaves. Sara went to her politely. "As your papa has engaged a French maid for you," she began, "I conclude that he wishes you to make a special study of the French language." Sara felt a little awkward. "I think he engaged her," she said, "because he thought I would like her, Miss Minchin." "I am afraid," said Miss Minchin with a slightly sour smile, "that you have been a very spoiled little girl and always imagine that things are done because you like them. My impression is that your papa wishes you to learn French." If Sara had been older or less punctilious about being quite polite to people, she could have explained herself in a very few words, but as it was, she felt a flush rising on her cheeks. Miss Minchin was a very severe and imposing person, and she seemed so absolutely sure that Sara knew nothing whatever of French that she felt as if it would be almost rude to correct her. The truth was that Sara could not remember the time when she had not seemed to know French. Her father had often spoken it to her when she had been a baby. Her mother had been a French woman, and Captain Crewe had loved her language, so it happened that Sara had always heard and been familiar with it. I have never really learned French, but," she began, trying shyly to make herself clear. One of Miss Minchin's chief secret annoyances was that she did not speak French herself, and was desirous of concealing the irritating fact. She therefore had no intention of discussing the matter and laying herself open to innocent questioning by a new little pupil. "That is enough," she said with polite tartness. "If you have not learned, you must begin at once. The French master, Monsieur Defarge, will be here in a few minutes. Take this book and look at it until he arrives." Sarah's cheeks felt warm. She went back to her seat and opened the book. She looked at the first page with a grave face. She knew it would be rude to smile, and she was very determined not to be rude. But it was very odd to find herself expected to study a page which told her that le père meant the father and la mère meant the mother. Miss Minchin gazed towards her scrutinizingly. "You look rather cross, Sarah," she said. "I am sorry you do not like the idea of learning French." "I am very fond of it," answered Sarah, thinking she would try again. "But—" "You must not say but when you are told to do things," said Miss Minchin. "Look at your book again." And Sarah did so, and did not smile even when she found that le fils meant the son and le frère meant the brother. "When Monsieur Defarge comes," she thought, "I can make him understand." Monsieur Defarge arrived very shortly afterwards. He was a very nice, intelligent, middle-aged Frenchman, and he looked interested when his eyes fell upon Sarah, trying politely to seem absorbed in her little book of phrases. "Is this a new pupil for me, madame?" he said to Miss Minchin. "I hope that is my good fortune. Her papa, Captain Crewe, is very anxious that she should begin the language, but I am afraid she has a childish prejudice against it. She does not seem to wish to learn," said Miss Minchin. "I am sorry of that, mademoiselle," he said kindly to Sarah. "Perhaps when we begin to study together, I may show you that it is a charming tongue." Little Sarah rose in her seat. She was beginning to feel rather desperate, as if she were almost in disgrace. She looked up into Monsieur Defarge's face with her big grey-green eyes, and they were quite innocently appealing. She knew that he would understand as soon as she spoke. She began to explain quite simply, in pretty and fluent French. Madame had not understood. She had not learned French exactly, not out of books, but her papa and other people had always spoken it to her, and she had read it and written it as she had read and written English. Her papa loved it, and she loved it because he did. Her dear mamma, who had died when she was born, had been French. She would be glad to learn anything Monsieur would teach her, but what she had tried to explain to Madame was that she already knew the words in this book, and she held out the little book of phrases. When she began to speak, Miss Minchin started quite violently and sat staring at her over her eyeglasses, almost indignantly, until she had finished. Monsieur Defarge began to smile, and his smile was one of great pleasure. To hear this pretty, childish voice, speaking his own language so simply and charmingly, made him feel almost as if he were in his native land, which in dark, foggy days in London sometimes seemed worlds away. When she had finished, he took the phrase book from her, with a look most affectionate, but he spoke to Miss Minchin. "Ah, madame," he said, "there is not much I can teach her. She has not learned French. She is French. Her accent is exquisite." "You ought to have told me," exclaimed Miss Minchin, much mortified, turning to Sarah. I tried," said Sarah. I suppose I did not begin right." Miss Minchin knew she had tried, and that it had not been her fault that she was not allowed to explain. And when she saw that the pupils had been listening, and that Lavinia and Jessie were giggling behind their French grammars, she felt infuriated. "Silence, young ladies," she said severely, rapping upon the desk. "Silence at once." And she began from that minute to feel rather a grudge against her show pupil. Excuse me, I'm just get a little bit more comfortable. There, that's better. And that was the end of chapter 2, and we shall have chapter 3 once I have had a drink. This is my lunch. It's a smoothie. And my drink of water. I do hope you remembered to bring your water so you can have your water while I'm having mine. And I probably didn't say hello to everybody before, but I'm hoping that Nikki is here and that Lemon is here and that, I can't remember my other names at the moment. Anyway, I hope all my friends are here able to listen today, and we shall continue. Are you ready? Oh, hang on, itchy eye. There, that's better. Now, carrying on with A Little Princess, Chapter 3, Ermengarde. Oh, that's an interesting name. On that first morning when Sara sat at Miss Minchin's side, aware that the whole schoolroom was devoting itself to observing her, she had noticed very soon one little girl about her own age who looked at her very hard, with a pair of light, rather dull blue eyes. She was a fat child who did not look as if she were in the least clever, but she had a good-naturedly pouting mouth. Her flaxen hair was braided in a tight pigtail, tied with a ribbon, and she had pulled this pigtail round her neck and was biting the end of the ribbon, resting her elbows on the desk as she stared wonderingly at the new pupil. When Monsieur Dufarge began to speak to Sara, she looked a little frightened, and when Sara stepped forward and, looking at him with the innocent appealing eyes, answered him without any warning in French, the fat little girl gave a startled jump and grew quite red in her awed amazement. Having wept hopeless tears for weeks in her efforts to remember that la mère meant the mother and le père the father when one spoke sensible English, it was almost too much for her to suddenly find herself listening to a child her own age who seemed not only quite familiar with these words, but apparently knew any number of others and could mix them up with verbs as if they were mere trifles. She stared so hard and bit the ribbon on her pigtail so fast that she attracted the attention of Miss Minchin, who, feeling extremely cross at the moment, immediately pounced upon her. "Miss St. John," she exclaimed severely, "what do you mean by such conduct? Remove your elbows, take your ribbon out of your mouth, sit up at once." Upon which Miss St. John, or Miss St. depending on which way you say it, gave another jump, and when Lavinia and Jessie tittered, she became redder than ever, so red indeed that she almost looked as if tears were coming into her poor, dull, childish eyes. And Sara saw her and was so sorry for her that she began to rather like her and want to be her friend. It was a way of hers always to want to spring into any fray in which someone was made uncomfortable or unhappy. If Sara had been a boy and lived a few centuries ago, her father used to say, she would have gone about the country with her sword drawn, rescuing and defending everyone in distress. She always wants to fight when she sees people in trouble. So she took rather a fancy to fat, slow, little Miss St. John, and kept glancing towards her through the morning. She saw that lessons were no easy matter to her, and that there was no danger of her ever being spoiled by being treated as a show pupil. Her French lesson was a pathetic thing. Her pronunciation made even Monsieur Dufarge smile in spite of himself, and Lavinia and Jessie and the more fortunate girls either giggled or looked at her in wondering disdain. But Sara did not laugh. She tried to look as if she did not hear when Miss St. John called le bon pain, le bon pain. She had a fine hot little temper of her own, and it made her feel rather savage when she heard the titters and saw this poor, stupid, distressed child's face. "It isn't funny, really," she said between her teeth as she bent over her book. "They ought not to laugh." When lessons were over, and the pupils gathered together in groups to talk, Sara looked for Miss St. John and found her bundled rather disconsolately in a window seat. She walked over to her and spoke. She only said the kind of thing little girls always say to each other by way of beginning an acquaintance. But there was something nice and friendly about Sara, and people always felt it. "What is your name?" she said. To explain Miss St. John's amazement, one must recall that a new pupil is, for a short time, a somewhat uncertain thing, and of this new pupil the entire school had talked the night before until it fell asleep quite exhausted by excitement and contradictory stories. A new pupil with a carriage and a pony and a maid and a voyage from India to discuss was not an ordinary acquaintance. "My name's Ermengarde St. John," she answered. "Mine is Sara Crewe," said Sara. "Yours is very pretty. It sounds like a storybook." "Do you like it?" fluttered Ermengarde. I like yours." Miss St. John's chief trouble in life was that she had a clever father. Sometimes this seemed to her a dreadful calamity. If you have a father who knows everything, who speaks 7 or 8 languages and has thousands of volumes which he has apparently learned by heart, he frequently expects you to be familiar with the contents of your lesson books at least. And it is not improbable that he will feel you ought to be able to remember a few incidents of history and to write a French exercise. Ermengarde was a severe trial to Mr. St. John. He could not understand how a child of his could be a notably and unmistakably dull creature who never shone in anything. "Good heavens," he had said more than once as he stared at her, "there are times when I think she's as stupid as her Aunt Eliza." Pardon me. If her Aunt Eliza had been slow to learn and quick to forget a thing entirely when she had learned it, Ermengarde was strikingly like her. She was the monumental dunce of the school, and it could not be denied. Oh dear. "She must be made to learn," her father said to Miss Minchin. Consequently, Ermengarde spent the greater part of her life in disgrace or in tears. She learned things and forgot them. Or if she remembered them, she did not understand them. So it was natural that, having made Sara's acquaintance, she should sit and stare at her with profound admiration. "You can speak French, can't you?" she said respectfully. Sara got up onto the window seat, which was a big, deep one, and tucking up her feet, sat with her hands clasped around her knees. "I can speak it because I've heard it all my life," she answered. "You could speak it if you had always heard it." "Oh, I couldn't. No, I couldn't," said Ermengarde. "I never could speak it." "Why?" inquired Sara curiously. Ermengarde shook her head so that the pigtail wobbled. "You heard me just now," she said. "I'm always like that. I can't say the words. They're so queer." She paused a moment and then added with a touch of awe in her voice, "You are very clever, aren't you?" Sara looked out of the window into the dingy square where the sparrows were hopping and twittering on the wet iron railings and the sooty branches of the trees. She reflected a few moments. She had heard it said very often that she was clever, and she wondered if she was, and if she was, how it had happened. "I don't know," she said. "I can't tell." Then, seeing a mournful look on the round, chubby face, she gave a little laugh and changed the subject. "Would you like to see Emily?" she inquired. "Who is Emily?" Ermengarde asked, just as Miss Minchin had done. "Come up to my room and see," said Sara, holding out her hand. They jumped down from the window seat together and went upstairs. "Is it true?" Ermengarde whispered as they went through the hall. "Is it true that you have a playroom all to yourself?" "Yes," Sara answered. "Papa asked Miss Minchin to let me have one because, well, it was because when I play I make up stories and tell them to myself, and I don't like people to hear me. It spoils it if I think people listen." They had reached the passage leading to Sara's room by this time, and Ermengarde stopped short, staring and quite losing her breath. "You make up stories," she gasped. "Can you do that, as well as speak French? Can you?" Sara looked at her in simple surprise. "Why, anyone can make up things," she said. "Have you never tried?" She put her hand warningly on Ermengarde's. "Let us go very quietly to the door," she whispered, "and then I will open it quite suddenly. Perhaps we may catch her." She was half laughing, but there was a touch of mysterious hope in her eyes, which fascinated Ermengarde, though she had not the remotest idea what it meant, nor whom it was she wanted to catch, or why she wanted to catch her. Whatsoever she meant, Ermengarde was sure it was something delightfully exciting. So, quite thrilled with expectation, she followed her on tiptoe along the passage. They had made not the least noise until they reached the door. Then Sara suddenly turned the handle and threw it wide open. Its opening revealed the room, quite neat and quiet, a fire gently burning in the grate, and a wonderful doll sitting in a chair by it, apparently reading a book. Oh, she got back into her seat before we could see her, Sara exclaimed. Of course they always do. They are as quick as lightning. Ermengarde looked from her to the doll and back again. Can she walk? She asked breathlessly. Yes, answered Sara. At least I believe she can. At least I pretend I believe she can. And that makes it seem as if it were true. Have you never pretended things? No, said Ermengarde, never. Tell me about it. She was so bewitched by this odd new companion that she actually stared at Sara instead of at Emily, notwithstanding that Emily was the most attractive doll person she had ever seen. Let us sit down, said Sara, and I will tell you. It's so easy that when you begin you can't stop. You just go on and on doing it always, and it's beautiful. Emily, you must listen. This is Ermengarde St. John. Emily? Ermengarde, this is Emily. Would you like to hold her? Oh, may I, said Ermengarde. May I really? She is beautiful. And Emily was put into her arms. Never in her dull, short life had Miss St. John dreamed of such an hour as the one she spent with the queer new pupil before they heard the lunch bell ring and were obliged to go downstairs. Sara sat upon the hearthrug and told her strange things. She sat rather huddled up, and her green eyes shone and her cheeks flushed. She told stories of the voyage and stories of India, but what fascinated Ermengarde the most was her fancy about the dolls who walked and talked, and who could do anything they chose when the human beings were out of the room, but who must keep their powers a secret, and so flew back to their places like lightning when people returned to the room. We couldn't do it, said Sara seriously. You see, it's a kind of magic. Once when she was relating the story of the search for Emily, Ermengarde saw her face suddenly change. A cloud seemed to pass over it and put out the light in her shining eyes. She drew her breath in so sharply that it made a funny, sad little sound, and then she shut her lips and held them tightly closed, as if she were determined either to do or not to do something. Ermengarde had an idea that if she had been like any other little girl, she might have suddenly burst out sobbing and crying. But she did not. Have you a pain? Ermengarde ventured. Yes, Sara answered after a moment's silence, but it is not in my body. Then she added something in a low voice which she tried to keep quite steady, and it was this. Do you love your father more than anything else in the whole world? Ermengarde's mouth fell open a little. She knew that it would be far from behaving like a respectable child at a select seminary to say that it had never occurred to you that you could love your father, that you would do anything desperate to avoid being left alone in his society for 10 minutes. She was indeed greatly embarrassed. I scarcely ever see him, she stammered. He is always in the library reading things. I love mine more than all the world 10 times over, Sara said. That is what my pain is. He has gone away. She put her head quietly down on her little huddled-up knees and sat very still for a few minutes. She's going to cry out loud, thought Ermengarde fearfully. But she did not. Her short black locks tumbled about her ears, and she sat still. Then she spoke, without lifting her head. I promised him I would bear it, she said, and I will. You have to bear things. Think what soldiers bear. Papa is a soldier. If there was a war, he would have to bear marching and thirstiness and perhaps deep wounds, and he would never say a word, not one word. Ermengarde could only gaze at her, but she felt that she was beginning to adore her. She was so wonderful and different from anyone else. Presently she lifted her face and shook back her black locks with a queer little smile. If I go on talking and talking, she said, and telling you things about pretending, I shall bear it better. You don't forget, but you bear it better. Ermengarde did not know why a lump came into her throat, and her eyes felt as if tears were in them. Lavinia and Jessie are best friends, she said rather huskily. I wish we could be best friends. Would you have me for yours? You're clever and I'm the stupidest child in the school, but I do so like you. I'm glad of that, said Sara. It makes you thankful when you are liked. Yes, we will be friends, and I'll tell you what, a sudden gleam lighting her face. "I shall help you with your French lessons." And that's the end of that chapter, which was chapter 3, and I'll have another drink of water, so you have yours too. Now, if you're watching this and you like these sort of stories, you might want to follow me. So if you're on Twitch, that means on that side down there, there's a little heart below the screen. And if you click on that, it'll let you know when you're online if I'm live. And you'll be able to see it. And it also means you'll be able to find my page again more easily and come back and watch some more of the stories if you've missed any of the other ones. If you're watching this on YouTube, then you go to the same place that's down there and click on the subscribe button, and YouTube will show you if I have done any new stories or new recordings. So there you go. That way you can keep in touch with what stories are happening. And it also means that you'll be able to chat with me or chat with my friends in the chat while I am reading. So there you go. Right, chapter 4, Lottie. If Sara had been a different kind of child, the life she led at Miss Minchin's select seminary for the next 10 years would not have been at all good for her. She was treated more as if she were a distinguished guest at the establishment than if she were a mere little girl. If she had been a self-opinionated, domineering child, she might have become disagreeable enough to be unbearable, though through being so much indulged and flattered. If she had been an indolent child, she would have learned nothing. Privately, Miss Minchin disliked her, but she was far too worldly a woman to do or say anything which might make such a desirable pupil wish to leave her school. She knew quite well that if Sara wrote to her papa to tell him she was uncomfortable or unhappy, Captain Crewe would remove her at once. Miss Minchin's opinion was that if a child was continually praised and never forbidden to do what she liked, she would be sure to be fond of the place where she was so treated. Accordingly, Sara was praised for her quickness at her lessons, for her good manners, for her amiability to her fellow pupils, for her generosity if she gave sixpence to a beggar out of her full little purse. The simplest thing she did was treated as if it were a virtue, and if she had not had a disposition and clever little brain, she might have been a very self-satisfied young person. But the clever little brain told her a great many sensible and true things about herself and her circumstances, and now and then she talked these things over to Ermengarde as time went on. "Things happen to people by accident," she used to say. "A lot of nice accidents have happened to me. It just happened that I always liked lessons and books and could remember things when I learned them. It just happened that I was born with a father who was beautiful and nice and clever and could give me everything I liked. Perhaps I have not really a good temper at all, but if you have everything you want and everyone is kind to you, how can you help but be good-tempered? I don't know," looking quite serious, "how I shall ever find out whether I am really a nice child or a horrid one. Perhaps I'm a hideous child and no one will ever know just because I never have any trials." "Lavinia has no trials," said Ermengarde stolidly, "and she is horrible enough." Sara rubbed the end of her little nose reflectively as she thought the matter over. "Well," she said at last, perhaps that is because Lavinia is growing." This was the result of a charitable recollection of having heard Miss Amelia say that Lavinia was growing so fast that she believed it affected her health and temper. Lavinia, in fact, was spiteful. She was inordinately jealous of Sara. Until the new pupil's arrival, she had felt herself the leader in the school. She had led because she was capable of making herself extremely disagreeable if the others did not follow her. She domineered over the little children and assumed grand airs with those big enough to be her companions. She was rather pretty and had been the best-dressed pupil in the procession when the select seminary walked out 2 by 2, until Sara's velvet coats and sable muffs appeared, combined with drooping ostrich feathers, and were led by Miss Minchin at the head of the line. This at the beginning had been bitter enough, but as time went on it became apparent that Sara was a leader too. and not because she could make her mind not because she could make herself disagreeable, but because she never did. "There's one thing about Sara Crewe," Jessie had enraged her best friend by saying honestly. "She's never grand about herself the least bit, and you know she might be, Lavvy. I believe I couldn't help being just a little if I had so many fine things and was made such a fuss over. It's disgusting the way Miss Minchin shows her off when parents come." "Dear Sara must come into the drawing room and talk to Mrs. Musgrave about India," mimicked Lavinia in her most highly favoured imitation of Miss Minchin. "Dear Sara must speak French to Lady Pitkin. Her accent is so perfect." "She didn't learn her French at the seminary, at any rate, and there's nothing so clever in her knowing it. She says herself she didn't learn it at all. She just picked it up because she always heard her papa speak it. And as to her papa, there is nothing so grand in being an Indian officer." "Well," said Jessie slowly, "he's killed tigers. He killed the one in the skin Sara has in her room. That's why she likes it so. She lies on it and strokes its head and talks to it as if it was a cat," because they used to hunt animals. She's always doing something silly," snapped Lavinia. "My mamma says that way of hers of pretending things is silly. She says she will grow up eccentric." It was quite true that Sara was never grand. She was a friendly little soul and shared her privileges and belongings with a free hand. The little ones, who were accustomed to being disdained and ordered out of the way by mature ladies aged 10 and 12, were never made to cry by this most envied of them all. She was a motherly young person, and when people fell down and scraped their knees, she ran and helped them up, and patted them, or found in her pocket a bonbon or some other article of a soothing nature, that's sweets or lollies. She never pushed them out of her way or alluded to their years as a humiliation and a blot upon their small characters. "If you are 4, you are 4, she said severely to Lavinia on an occasion of her having, it must be confessed, slapped Lottie and called her a brat. "But you will be 5 next year and 6 the year after that. And," opening large, convicting eyes, "it only takes 16 years to make you 20. "Dear me," said Lavinia, "how we can calculate." In fact, it was not to be denied that 16 and 4 made 20, and 20 was an age the most daring were scarcely bold enough to dream of. So the younger children adored Sara. More than once she had been known to have a tea party made up of these despised ones in her own room, and Emily had been played with, and Emily's own tea service used, the one with cups which held quite a lot of much sweetened weak tea and had blue flowers on them. No one had seen such a very real doll's tea set before. From that afternoon Sara was regarded as a goddess and a queen by the entire alphabet class. So that's the new entrants, the ones young enough to learn their alphabets. Lottie Lee worshipped her to such an extent that if Sara had not been a motherly person, she would have found her tiresome. Lottie had been sent to school by a rather flighty young papa, who could not imagine what else to do with her. Her young mother had died, and as the child had been treated like a favourite doll or a very spoiled pet monkey or a lap dog ever since the first hour of her life, she was a very appalling little creature. When she wanted anything or did not want anything, she wept and howled, and as she always wanted the things she could not have, and did not want the things that were best for her, her shrill little voice was usually to be heard uplifted in wails in one part of the house or another. Her strongest weapon was that, in some mysterious way, she had found out that a very small girl who had lost her mother was a person who ought to be pitied and much made of. She had probably heard some grown-up people talking her over in the early days after her mother's death, so it became her habit to make great use of this knowledge. The first time Sara took her in charge was one morning when, on passing a sitting room, she heard both Miss Minchin and Miss Amelia trying to suppress the angry wails of some child who evidently refused to be silenced. She refused so strenuously indeed that Miss Minchin was obliged to almost shout in a stately and severe manner to make herself heard. "What is she crying for?" she almost yelled. Oh, Sara heard. "I haven't got any mamma." "Oh, Lottie," screamed Miss Amelia, "do stop, darling. Don't cry. Please don't." Oh, Lottie howled tempestuously. "Haven't got any mamma." "She ought to be whipped," said Miss Minchin, proclaimed. "You shall be whipped, you naughty child." Lottie wailed more loudly than ever. Miss Amelia began to cry. Miss Minchin's voice rose until it almost thundered. Then suddenly she sprang up from her chair in impotent indignation and flounced off out of the room, leaving Miss Amelia to arrange the matter. Sara had paused in the hall, wondering if she ought to go into the room, because she had recently begun a friendly acquaintance with Lottie and might be able to quiet her. When Miss Minchin came out and saw her, she looked rather annoyed. She realized that her voice, as heard from inside the room, could not have sounded either dignified or amiable. "Oh, Sara," she exclaimed, endeavouring to produce a suitable smile. "I stopped," explained Sara, "because I knew it was Lottie, and I thought perhaps, just perhaps, I could make her be quiet. May I try, Miss Minchin?" "If you can. You are a clever child," answered Miss Minchin, drawing in her mouth sharply. Then, seeing Sara looked slightly chilled by her asperity, she changed her manner. "But you are clever in everything," she said in her approving way. "I dare say you can manage her. Go in." And she left her. When Sara entered the room, Lottie was lying upon the floor, screaming and kicking her small, fat legs violently, and Miss Amelia was bending over her in consternation and despair, looking quite red and damp with heat. Lottie was always found in her nursery. Quite red and damp with heat. Lottie had always found, when in her own nursery at home, that kicking and screaming would always be quieted by any means she insisted on. Poor plump Miss Amelia was trying first one method and then another. "Poor darling," she said one moment, "I know you haven't any mamma, poor," and then in quite another tone, "If you don't stop, Lottie, I will shake you, you poor little angel. There, you wicked, bad, detestable child. I will smack you, I will." Sara went to them quietly. She did not know at all what she was going to do, but she had a vague inward conviction that it would be better not to say such different kinds of things quite so helplessly and excitedly. "Miss Amelia," she said in a low voice, "Miss Minchin says I may try to make her stop. May I?" Miss Amelia turned and looked at her hopelessly. "Oh, do you think you can?" "I don't know whether I can," answered Sara, still in her half-whisper, "but I will try." Miss Amelia stumbled up from her knees with a heavy sigh, and Lottie's fat little legs kicked as hard as ever. "If you will steal out of the room," said Sara, "I will stay with her." "Oh, Sara," almost whimpered Miss Amelia, "we never had such a dreadful child before. I don't believe we can keep her." But she crept out of the room and was very much relieved to find an excuse for doing it. Sara stood by the howling, furious child for a few moments and looked down at her without saying anything. Then she sat down flat on the floor beside her and waited. Except for Lottie's angry screams, the room was quite quiet. This was a new state of affairs for little Miss Lee, who was accustomed, when she screamed, to hear other people protest and implore and command and coax by turns. To lie and kick and shriek and find the only person near you not seeming to mind in the least attracted her attention. She opened her tight-shut, streaming eyes to see who this person was, and it was only another little girl. But it was the one who owned Emily and all the nice things, and she was looking at her steadily as if she were merely thinking. Having paused for a few seconds to find this out, Lottie thought she must begin again, but the quiet of the room and of Sara's odd, interested face made her first howl rather half-hearted. "I haven't Any ma, she announced, but her voice was not so strong. Sara looked at her still more steadily, but with a sort of understanding in her eyes. Neither have I, she said. This was so unexpected that it was astounding. Lottie actually dropped her legs, gave a wriggle, and lay and stared. A new idea will stop a crying child when nothing else will. Also, it was true that while Lottie disliked Miss Minchin, who was cross, and Miss Amelia, who was foolishly indulgent, she rather liked Sara, little as she knew her. She did not want to give up her grievance, but her thoughts were distracted from it, so she wriggled again, and after a sulky sob said, "Where is she?" Sara paused a moment, because she had been told that her mamma was in heaven. She had thought a great deal about the matter, and her thoughts had been quite like those of other people. Had not been quite like those of other people. "She went to heaven," she said, "but I'm sure she comes out sometimes to see me, though I don't see her. So does yours. Perhaps they can both see us now. Perhaps they are both in this room." Lottie sat bolt upright and looked about her. She was a pretty little curly-headed creature, and her round eyes were like wet forget-me-nots. If her mamma had seen her during the last half-hour, she might not have thought her the kind of child who ought to be related to an angel. Sara went on talking. Perhaps some people might think that what she said was rather like a fairy story, but it was all so real to her own imagination that Lottie began to listen in spite of herself. She had been told that her mamma had wings and a crown, and she had been shown pictures of ladies in beautiful white nightgowns who were said to be angels. But Sara seemed to be telling a real story about a lovely country where real people were. "There are fields and fields of flowers," she began, forgetting herself, as usual, when she began, and talking rather as if she were in a dream. "Fields and fields of lilies, and when the soft wind blows over them, it wafts the scent of them into the air, and everybody always breathes it, because the soft wind is always blowing. And little children run about in the lily fields and gather armfuls of them, and laugh and make little wreaths, and the streets are shining, and no one is ever tired, however far they walk. They can float anywhere they like. And there are walls made of pearl and gold all round the city, but they are low enough for the people to go and lean on them, and look down onto the earth, and smile, and send beautiful messages." Whatsoever story she had begun to tell, Lottie would no doubt have stopped crying, and been fascinated into listening. But there was no denying that the story was prettier than most others. She dragged herself close to Sara and drank in every word, until the end came, far too soon. When it did come, she was so sorry that she put up her lip ominously. "I want to go there," she cried. I haven't any mamma in this school." Sara saw the danger signal and came out of her dream. She took hold of the chubby hand and pulled her close to her side with a coaxing little laugh. "I will be your mamma," she said. "We will play that you are my little girl, and Emily shall be your sister." Lottie's dimples all began to show themselves. "Shall she?" she said. "Yes," answered Sara, jumping up to her feet. "Let us go and tell her, and then I will wash your face and brush your hair." To which Lottie agreed quite cheerfully, and trotted out of the room and upstairs with her, without seeming even to remember that the whole of the last hour's tragedy had been caused by the fact that she had refused to be washed and brushed for lunch, and Miss Minchin had been called in to use her majestic authority. And from that time, Sara was an adopted mother. And that is the end of chapter 4. My, we are really buzzing through this one, aren't we? So far. We shall have one more chapter, chapter 5, for today, and then we will have a pause before next time we read, which will be the next session. Chapter 5, Becky. And I need a drink of water, and you probably do too. Chapter 5, Becky. Of course, the greatest power Sara possessed, and the one which gained her even more followers than her luxuries, and the fact that she was the show pupil, the power that Lavinia and certain other girls were most envious of, and at the same time most fascinated by in spite of themselves, was her power of telling stories, and of making everything she talked about seem like a story, whether it was or not. Anyone who has been at school with a teller of stories knows what the wonder means, how he or she is followed about and besought in a whisper to relate romances, how groups gather round and hang on the outskirts of the favoured party in the hope of being allowed to join it and listen. Sara not only could tell stories, but she adored telling them. When she sat or stood in the midst of a circle and began to invent wonderful things, her green eyes grew big and shining, her cheeks flushed, and without knowing that she was doing it, she began to act and made what she told lovely or alarming by the raising or dropping of her voice, and the bend and sway of her slim body, and the dramatic movement of her hands. She forgot that she was talking to listening children. She saw and lived with the fairy folk, or the kings and queens and beautiful ladies whose adventures she was narrating. Sometimes when she had finished her story, she was quite out of breath with excitement, and would lay her hand on her thin little quick-rising chest, and half laugh as if at herself. "When I am telling it," she would say, "it doesn't seem as if it was only made up. It seems more real than you are, more real than the schoolroom. I feel as if I were all the people in the story, one after the other. It is odd." She had been at Miss Minchin's school about 2 years, when one foggy winter's afternoon, as she was getting out of the carriage, comfortably wrapped up in her warmest velvets and furs, and looking very much grander than she knew, she caught sight as she crossed the pavement of a dingy little figure standing on the area steps. That's the steps that go down to the servants' area. That's the area. The area steps, and stretching its neck so that its wide open eyes might peer at her through the railings. Something in the eagerness and timidity of the smudgy face made her look at it, and when she looked she smiled, because it was her way to smile at people. That was one of the things she did, was she smiled at people. But the owner of the smudgy face and the wide open eyes evidently was afraid that she ought not to have been caught looking at pupils of importance. She dodged out of sight like a jack-in-the-box and scurried back into the kitchen, disappearing so suddenly that if she had not been such a poor little forlorn thing, Sara would have laughed in spite of herself. That very evening, as Sara was sitting in the midst of a group of listeners in a corner of the schoolroom, telling one of her stories, the very same figure timidly entered the room, carrying a coal box much too heavy for her, and knelt down upon the hearthrug to replenish the fire and sweep up the ashes. She was cleaner than she had been when she peeped through the area railings, but she looked just as frightened. She was evidently afraid to look at the children, or seemed to be listening. She put on pieces of coal cautiously with her fingers so that she might make no disturbing noise, and she swept about the fire irons very softly. But Sara saw in 2 minutes that she was deeply interested in what was going on, and that she was doing her work slowly in the hope of catching a word here and there, and realizing this, she raised her voice and spoke more clearly. The mermaids swam softly about in the crystal green water and dragged after them a fishing net woven of deep-sea pearls, she said. The princess sat on the white rock and watched them. It was a wonderful story about a princess who was loved by a prince merman and went to live with him in the shining caves under the sea. The small drudge before the grate swept the hearth once, and then swept it again. Having done it twice, she did it 3 times, and as she was doing it the 3rd time, the sound of the story so lured her to listen that she fell under the spell and actually forgot that she had no right to listen at all, and also forgot everything else. She sat down upon her heels as she knelt on the hearthrug, and the brush hung idly in her fingers. The voice of the storyteller went on and drew her into winding grottos under the sea, glowing with soft, clear blue light and paved with pure golden sands. Strange sea flowers and grasses waved about her, and far away faint singing and music echoed. The hearth-brush fell from the work-roughened hand, and Lavinia Herbert looked round. "That girl has been listening," she said. The culprit snatched up her brush and scrambled to her feet. She caught at the coal-box and simply scuttled out of the room like a frightened rabbit. Sara felt rather hot-tempered. "I knew she was listening," she said. "Why shouldn't she?" Lavinia tossed her head with great elegance. "Well," she remarked, "I do not know whether your mamma would like you to tell stories to servant girls, but I know my mamma wouldn't like me to do it." "My mamma," said Sara, looking odd. "I don't believe she would mind in the least. She knows that stories belong to everybody." "I thought," retorted Lavinia in severe recollection, "that your mamma was dead. How can she know things?" "Do you think she doesn't know things?" said Sara in her stern little voice. Sometimes she had a rather stern little voice. "Sarah's mamma knows everything," piped in Lottie. "So does my mamma, except Sara is my mamma at Miss Minchin's. My other one knows everything. The streets are shining, and there are fields and fields of lilies, and everybody gathers them. Sara tells me when she puts me to bed." "You wicked thing," said Lavinia, turning on Sara, "making fairy stories about heaven." "There are much more splendid stories in Revelation," returned Sara. "Just look and see. How do you know mine are fairy stories? But I can tell you," with a fine bit of unheavenly temper, "you will never find out whether they are or not if you're not kinder to people than you are now. Come along, Lottie." And she marched out of the room, rather hoping she might see the little servant girl again somewhere. But she found no trace of her when she got into the hall. "Who is that little girl who makes the fires?" she asked Mariette that night. Mariette broke forth into a flow of description. Ah, indeed, Mademoiselle Sara might well ask. She was a forlorn little thing who had just taken the place of scullery maid, though as to being a scullery maid she was everything else besides. She blackened boots and grates and carried heavy coal scuttles up and down stairs, and scrubbed floors and cleaned windows, and was ordered about by everybody. She was 14 years old, but was so stunted in growth that she looked about 12. In truth, Mariette was sorry for her. She was so timid that if one chanced to speak to her, it appeared as if her poor frightened eyes would jump out of her head. "What is her name?" asked Sara, who had sat by the table with her chin on her hands, as she listened absorbedly to the recital. Her name was Becky. Mariette had heard everyone below stairs calling, "Becky, do this," and "Becky, do that," every 5 minutes in the day. Sara sat and looked into the fire, reflecting on Becky for some time after Mariette left her. She made up a story of which Becky was the ill-used heroine. She thought she looked as if she had never had quite enough to eat. Her very eyes were hungry. She hoped that she should see her again, but thought she caught sight of her carrying things up or downstairs on several occasions. Though she caught sight of her, she always seemed in such a hurry and so afraid of being seen that it was impossible to speak to her. But a few weeks later, on another foggy afternoon, when she entered her sitting room, she found herself confronting a rather pathetic picture. In her own special and pet easy chair before the bright fire, Becky, with a coal smudge on her nose, and several on her apron, with her poor little cap hanging half off her head, and an empty coal box on the floor near her, sat fast asleep, tired out beyond even the endurance of her hard-worked young body. She had been sent up to put the bedrooms in order for the evening. There were a great many of them, and she had been running about all day. Sara's rooms she had saved until the last. They were not like the other rooms, which were plain and bare. Ordinary pupils were expected to be satisfied with mere necessaries. Sara's comfortable sitting room seemed a bower of luxury to the scullery maid, though it was in fact merely a nice bright little room. But there were pictures and books in it, and curious things from India. There was a sofa and the low, soft chair. Emily sat in a chair of her own with the air of a presiding goddess, and there was always a glowing fire and a polished grate. Becky saved it until the end of her afternoon's work, because it rested her to go into it, and she always hoped to snatch a few minutes to sit down in the soft chair and look about her, and think about the wonderful good fortune of the child who owned such surroundings, and who went out on the cold days in beautiful hats and coats one tried to get a glimpse of through the area railing. On this afternoon, when she had sat down, the sensation of relief to her short, aching legs had been so wonderful and delightful that it had seemed to soothe her whole body, and the glow of warmth and comfort from the fire had crept over her like a spell, until, as she looked at the red coals, a tired, slow smile stole over her smudged face. Her head nodded forward without her being aware of it, her eyes drooped, and she fell fast asleep. She had really been only about 10 minutes in the room when Sara entered, but she was in as deep a sleep as if she had been, like the Sleeping Beauty, slumbering for 100 years. But she did not look, poor Becky, like a Sleeping Beauty at all. She looked only like an ugly, stunted, worn-out little scullery drudge. Sara seemed as much unlike her as if she were a creature from another world. On this particular afternoon she had been taking her dancing lesson, and the afternoon on which the dancing master appeared was rather a grand occasion at the seminary, though it occurred every week. The pupils were attired in their prettiest frocks, and as Sara danced particularly well, she was very much brought forward, and Mariette was requested to make her as diaphanous and fine as possible. Diaphanous is very light, thin, floaty fabric. Effect. Today a frock the colour of a rose had been put on her, and Mariette had bought some real buds and made her a wreath to wear on her black locks. She had been learning a new delightful dance in which she had been skimming and flying about the room like a large rose-coloured butterfly, and the enjoyment and exercise had brought a brilliant happy glow into her face. When she entered the room she floated in with the few of the butterfly steps, and there sat Becky, nodding her cap sideways off her head. "Oh," cried Sara softly when she saw her, "that poor thing." It did not occur to her to feel cross at finding her pet chair occupied by the small dingy figure. To tell the truth, she was quite glad to find it there. When the ill-used heroine of her story wakened, she could talk to her. She crept towards her quietly and stood looking at her. Becky gave a little snore. "I wish she'd waken herself," Sara said. "I don't like to waken her, but Miss Minchin would be cross if she found out. I'll just wait a few minutes." She took a seat on the edge of the table and sat, swinging her slim rose-coloured legs and wondering what it would be best to do. Miss Amelia might come in at any moment, and if she did, Becky would be sure to be scolded. "But she is so tired," she thought. "She is so tired." A piece of flaming coal ended her perplexity for her at that very moment. It broke off from a large lump and fell on to the fender. Becky started and opened her eyes with a frightened gasp. She did not know she had fallen asleep. She had only sat down for one moment and felt the beautiful glow, and here she found herself staring in wild alarm at the wonderful pupil, who sat perched quite near her, like a rose-coloured fairy, with interested eyes. She sprang up and clutched at her cap. She felt it dangling over her ear, and tried wildly to put it straight. Oh, she had got herself into trouble now with a vengeance, to have impudently fallen asleep on such a young lady's chair. She would be turned out of doors without wages. She made a sound like a big breathless sob. Oh, miss," she stuttered. "I asked your pardon, miss. I do, miss." Sara jumped down and came quite close to her. "Don't be frightened," she said, quite as if she had been speaking to a little girl like herself. "It doesn't matter the least bit." "I didn't go to do it, miss," protested Becky. "It was the warm fire, and me being so tired. It wasn't impertinence." Sara broke into a friendly little laugh and put her hand on her shoulder. "You were tired," she said. "You could not help it. You are not really awake yet." How poor Becky stared at her. In fact, she had never heard such a nice friendly sound in anyone's voice before. She was used to being ordered about and scolded and having her ears boxed, and this one, in her rose-coloured dancing afternoon splendour, was looking at her as if she were not a culprit at all, as if she had been as if she had a right to be tired, even to fall asleep. The touch of the soft, slim little paw on her shoulder was the most amazing thing she had ever known. Ain't you angry, miss?" she gasped. "Ain't you going to tell the missus?" "No," cried out Sara, "of course I'm not." The woeful fright in the cold, smutted face made her suddenly so sorry she could scarcely bear it. One of her queer thoughts rushed into her mind. She put her hand against Becky's cheek. "Why," she said, "we are just the same. I am only a little girl, like you. It's just an accident that I am not you and you are not me." Becky did not understand in the least. Her mind could not grasp such amazing thoughts, and an accident meant to her a calamity in which someone was run over or fell off a ladder and was carried to the hospital. "A accident, miss?" she fluttered respectfully. "Is it?" "Yes," Sara answered, and she looked at her dreamily for a moment, but the next she spoke in a different tone. She realized that Becky did not know what she meant. "Have you done your work?" she asked. "Dare you stay here for a few minutes?" Becky lost her breath again. "Here, me, miss." Sara ran to the door, opened it and looked out and listened. "No one is anywhere about," she explained. "If your bedrooms are finished, perhaps you might stay a tiny while. I thought perhaps you might like a piece of cake." The next 10 minutes seemed to Becky like a sort of delirium. Sara opened a cupboard and gave her a thick slice of cake. She seemed to rejoice when it was devoured in hungry bites. She talked and asked questions and laughed until Becky's fears actually began to calm themselves, and she once or twice gathered boldness enough to ask a question or so herself, daring as she felt it to be. "Is that," she ventured, looking longingly at the rose-coloured frock, and she asked it almost in a whisper, "is that your best?" "It's one of my dancing frocks," answered Sara. "I like it, don't you?" For a few seconds Becky was almost speechless with admiration. Then she said in an awed voice, "Won't I see a princess? I was standing in the street outside Covent Garden watching the swells go into opera, and there was one everyone stared at most. They says to each other, 'That's the princess.' She was a growed-up young lady, but she was pink all over, gowned and cloak and flowers and all. I called her to mind the minute I see you sitting there on the table, miss. You looked like her." "I've often thought," said Sara in her reflecting voice, "that I should like to be a princess. I wonder what it feels like. I believe I will begin pretending I am one." Becky stared at her admiringly and, as before, did not understand her in the least. She watched her with a sort of admiration. Very soon Sara left her reflections and turned to her with a new question. "Becky," she said, "weren't you listening to that story?" "Yes, miss," confessed Becky, a little alarmed again. "I knowed I hadn't oughter, but it was that beautiful. I couldn't help it." "I liked you to listen to it," said Sara. "If you tell stories, you like nothing so much as to tell them to people who want to listen. I don't know why it is. Would you like to hear the rest?" "Me hear it," she cried, "like as if I was a pupil, miss. All about Prince and the little white moo-baby swimming about laughing, with stars in their hair." Sara nodded. "You haven't time to hear it now, I'm afraid," she said, "but if you will tell me just what time you come to do my rooms, I will try to be here and tell you a bit of it every day until it is finished. It's a lovely long one, and I'm always putting new bits to it." "Then," breathed Becky devoutly, "I wouldn't mind how heavy the coal box was, or what the cook done to me, if I might have that to think of." "You may," said Sara. "I'll tell it all to you." When Becky went downstairs, she was not the same Becky who had staggered up, loaded down by the weight of the coal scuttle. She had an extra piece of cake in her pocket, and she had been fed and warmed, but not only by cake and fire. Something else had warmed and fed her, and that something else was Sara. When she was gone, Sara sat on her favourite perch on the end of her table. Her feet were on a chair, her elbows on her knees, and her chin in her hands. "If I was a princess, a real princess," she murmured, "I could scatter largesse to the populace. But even if I am only a pretend princess, I can invent little things to do for people." Things like this. She was just as happy as if it was a largesse. I'll pretend that to do things people like is scattering largesse. I've scattered largesse. And that's the end of the last chapter for today. And now you've got a word that you can look up. Remember, we write down words we don't know and we look them up. So if you're not sure what largesse means, write it down. Largess. And then you'll know what she's talking about. How's that? And we shall see you next time. And for me, at the moment, it's Friday. So that means for me, I will see you on Monday, if nothing happens to stop me seeing you then. So bye-bye. Have lots of fun. Drink plenty of water. And maybe find some more books to read.